In this seventh talk, I want to start looking at the great period which we roughly term the Enlightenment. That is roughly from about 1700 to the end of the 18th century. This is really fascinating because it's when the modern social sciences as we know them were born. If you look at the roots of anthropology, sociology, linguistics, psychology, history, economics, then many of the great founders of these disciplines are rooted in the middle period of the 18th century. And many people have wondered why this should be the case and how they were influenced by the context of the time they were living in. And that's what I want to explore in the next couple of lectures. What really changed in the Enlightenment? Enlightenment means getting lighter from the darkness of previous ages, and so there is an idea of progressive rationality and progress of human beings being possible. This is the great change. The Renaissance, as I discussed in previous talks, was the birth of the idea of serial time, of things moving forward, not going back necessarily. Linear time. But linear time now becomes, instead of just going along, it begins to go upwards. It's progressive. This is the time of the polishing of manners and mind, of the enlightening of attitudes, of progress. And Hugh Trevor Roper, the historian, put it as follows: the idea of progress was the great discovery of the 18th century. We may have changed its content, but we can never renounce it. It gave, and still can give, meaning to a political program and to historical understanding. Keith Thomas, another historian, talks about this. The genuine innovators, Copernicus, Newton and so on, I quote, hesitated to believe that they had done any more than restore knowledge, which had been in man's possession at some earlier period of history, Renaissance. In, quote, politics, even the revolution of 1688-9 was presented as a restoration of ancient liberties, rather than the foundation of the new ones. Though Locke can be looked on now with his blackboard, this is me, with his blackboard view of the mind and insistence on individual rights as a philosopher for the new world, as he was taken in America, where his ideas formed the foundation of the political system, he didn't consider himself to be a new thinker. But by the end of the century, it was increasingly apparent that men were doing more than simply treading the paths of their ancestors. As we've seen, there was a vision of the possibility of new discoveries, that truth was not finalized. So we now have an idea of progress, but it doesn't necessarily yet imply moral advance. Where do we find these ideas? Well, we find them in two particular places which I'll look at. One is in Scotland, in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and one is in pre-revolutionary France. If we read Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, or in Scotland, Smith, Keynes, Hume, Robertson, Miller and the rest, we get a growing sense of optimism that things can be made better in at least material ways. While these people often retain some admiration for their classical ancestors, and indeed they all do, there was a growing self-confidence, a belief in the triumph of reason, a Above all, and this is what's really interesting, it happens not in England on the whole. You do get some people like Locke and Newton and so on, but it's just on the edges of England. In other words, in the Scottish Lowlands, which is on one edge, and in France, which is on the other side of the Channel, but very close. And this, I think, comes out, as I'll try and explain, in the shock of the contrast between what was happening in England, very visibly now, as these Scotsmen and Frenchmen visited it, and they all spent a good deal of time in England, wondering at the new world that seemed to be being born there, and wondering whether it could be transferred to their own countries. It gave a sense of a gap and a possibility of a path towards further improvement. And this is a period which roughly starts with the 1730s, 40s, with early Adam Smith, with Montesquieu's early work in the Persian letters and so on, and building up to the Spirit of the Laws, and reaches its culmination in The Wealth of Nations in 1786 and the Voyages of Cook, all of which showed muted admiration for the non-Western world, but a growing sense that something special was happening in Northwest Europe and particularly England. Of course, this was not a sudden breakthrough. The early part of the 18th century still has a good deal, and some of the middle part, of the idea of some kind of circularity and that things cannot progress indefinitely. For example, in Italy, Giovanni Battista Vico, who lived from 1668 to 1744, still had a basically cyclical view of time. He was an Italian philosopher born in Naples in great poverty. He became a teacher in the university, and his major work on the principles of the new science concerning the common nature of the nations in 1725 was basically still circular. I quote from the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. He conceived the Middle Ages as a return to primitive conditions of agricultural economy, of violence and subjection, of feudal relationships, serfdom or vassalage, or fierce and warlike religiosity, of aristocratic monarchies, of picture language and hieroglyphs, of heroic poetry. He was absorbed in the contemplation of the spiritual cycle in history, emergence from the bestial into the barbarian age, subsequent spiritual refinement through intellect and custom, some sense of progress, the transition of the era of humanity, and then, rather like Ibn Khaldun, things begin to fall apart and human spirit decays. I quote again, gradual enfeeblement in vital energy, corruption and relapse, and then the resumption of the cycle. Vico, accordingly, and this is the end of the quote, remained impervious to the idea of simple and linear progress, which was the concept of the new century. Early in the new century, in the 19th century, this is continuing the quotation, the discovery of Vico aroused the astonishment and the admiration of Italian philosophers, politicians, historians and jurists, who had noted the philosophic, political and historic weakness of the Enlightenment. So basically, as I'll explain, when there was a reaction against the Enlightenment in the early 19th century, Vico was rediscovered as someone who had prophesied that we cannot progress indefinitely. Another, to a certain extent, circular thinker, or at least static thinker, was Montesquieu. He was a functionalist. He saw the interconnection, the spirit of the laws was the interconnection, the interrelatedness of systems. And it's not therefore concerned really with a steady progress. And finally, Edward Gibbon, the great English historian, was concerned with the rise and then the decay, particularly the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. In Gibbon's eyes, again from the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, European history from the age of the Antonines to the downfall of the empire in the West is a record of immense and steady retrogression going backwards. He is inclined to attribute the disaster partially at least to the triumph of Christianity, and describes the rise and progress of the Church with a thinly veiled hostility. But he also looks at military, social and other causes. So these thinkers of the first half of the 18th century, or shaped by the first half of the 18th century, are still thinking in terms of rise and fall. But something new was stirring in Edinburgh and in Glasgow and in France. The preconditions, I think, are very well explained by Nisbet in his History of Sociological Thought, as being a clash of civilizations. He says, do we exaggerate in referring to the period as a golden age? And he refers to the work of Trotscher in his Historism and seine Probleme, suggesting that in ages of disparity, when two civilizations are contiguous, nearby, but very different, or a civilization is changing rapidly so that people have mixed loyalties and conflicting loyalties, that is the time when you get the birth of great new ideas. A transition from a social order of a traditional kind to a social order of a modern kind will lead to the rethinking of basic categories. I quote Nisbet, "What is ultimately and crucially required in such an age," Trotscher writes, "is a spark that is ignited during that very brief period when the two social orders are of almost equal power in the loyalties they inspire and the incentives they arouse in reflective minds. It is not the transition as such that precipitates the ideas. It is the confrontation, so to speak, of the two orders. Out of such confrontation comes friction." This, I think, applies very well to the Scottish Enlightenment, as it faced the differences between what was happening in England and further north in the Highlands of Scotland, and to the French who visited England, Voltaire, Montesquieu, later de Tocqueville and others, spent a lot of time in England looking at it and seeing the conflict, and they felt the tug of these two worlds, most famously perhaps put by de Tocqueville. His head was with the New Order, with America, with rationality, with the English. His heart was still embedded in the Ancien Régime of the traditional world, and he had to try and work out this conflict. So it's a conflict between a feudal traditional and a democratic capitalist world, as Nisbet sees it. And this generated these great works, laying the foundation for the social sciences. It generated, in other words, the Enlightenment, the growth of a sense of history and serial time, which began to spread over much of Europe. The new philosophies which laid the foundations of the social sciences, as we know them today, however, were mainly a product of one part of Europe, Northern Europe, France, England, parts of Germany, Holland, and particularly those two cultures which rubbed up against England, lowland Scotland and France, which questioned and interrogated what was happening. And this is a point well made by Ernest Gellner, who argues that sociology came into being because men were struck by the contrast between an old aristocratic agrarian military order and a commercial industrial bourgeois one, which seemed to be replacing it. And they sought the meaning. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, anyway, is an attempt to provide an analysis and blueprint for the new social order. As is usual, I think, in paradigm shifts, they tend to occur not right in the middle of the place where the new things are happening, because such new things are part of the air people breathe. It's just on the edges, looking at it. Thus, for example, the great analysis of European political and social systems in East Asia was done from Japan, looking at Europe by Fukuzawa. Thus, if we look at the work of the brilliant groups of Scottish philosophers, mainly historians, lawyers, and so on, we find in Keynes, Adam Smith, David Hume, Dougal, Stewart, Ferguson, Miller, and others attempts to found a comparative discipline which will make sense of the new emerging bourgeois capitalist world, and the same with Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and so on. Thus, the 18th century gap, which began to transform serial explanations into ideas of progress, was a gap between different parts of Europe. It was clearly possible, men saw for the first time, to manipulate the institutions of a society and to generate rationality, tolerance, wealth. In other words, you could construct it. Before it was God-given, nothing much had changed, we can't change our world, but now we can become masters of our world. This gap was clearly very closely connected to the earlier ones I've talked about as the Renaissance began to feel a sense of difference from the medieval period. And it was part of a much wider realization of a gap, because Montesquieu, Smith, and most of the theorists were also interested in other parts of the world, and they could see a growing difference between Holland and England in particular, and places like China and India and the West Indies. So let's look at it in a little more detail. Let's look first of all at the Scottish Enlightenment. This is the movement from cyclical to progressive time in 18th century Scottish philosophy. Taking again Hay's book on analysts and historians, he says, in the civic humanist cycle, I'm paraphrasing, of the 16th to 18th centuries, there is at the beginning the cycle and the rise and fall, as in Gibbon. But with the Scottish Enlightenment, there was an idea of accumulation, of a rise of civilization, and of what was called then civil society, an idea of improvement. I quote, "In the story of the progress of mankind from rudeness to refinement, the barbarian loses his role as antitype, agent of nemesis, Ibn Khaldun, the hordes coming in and destroying civilizations, and even renovator, which the cycle of corruption would have assigned to him. He becomes merely the exemplar of a stage. The Highland Scots after 1745 were not going to come down and destroy the civilization to the south. They had been tamed. They were pastoral, nomadic, a stage, as many of the Scots philosophers put it, leading up through pastoralism into agrarian societies and then into modern bourgeois society." In fact, this was the great time of Scottish philosophy and history, of course. The first to bring erudition and history together, to combine narrative with social description analysis, were the Scots themselves. And again, Hay puts it as follows: "This was not accidental. Scottish universities and the coteries of cultivated men in the bigger towns were lively intellectual centres at a time when universities in Europe, and especially the two torpid seminaries of Oxford and Cambridge, were in their doldrums. At Edinburgh in particular, with its high courts of justice, and a well-educated bar, a good university, 3 libraries, we have a centre of research facilities without its equal in contemporary Europe. And the 2 great founders of Scottish historiography of that time, David Hume and William Robertson, were both Edinburgh men. And we find it in great lawyers, for example in Lord Kames, whose concept of the wonderful uniformity in the progress of religion through all nations, which, as a quotation again from Hay, here we have a foretaste of 19th century theories of religious evolution. Kames was a member of the Scottish school of social philosophers who, together with their French contemporaries like Turgot, Condorcet and Montesquieu, anticipated the Victorian anthropologists in their ideas of socio-cultural evolution, a methodology which was often called the comparative method, comparing the past with the present and other civilizations with our own. Lord Kames was followed and accompanied by many others: Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutcheson, Thomas Reid, Adam Smith, Dougal Stewart, John Miller, William Robertson and Lord Monboddo. And they tried to reconstruct the course of the stages of human social and cultural history from the very earliest time. They began to divide history into the stages which we still largely accept, though we give them different names: the stages of the savage, the barbaric and the civilized. And this, using the vastly accumulating evidence now being taken from documentary archives and from reports of other civilizations, began to place human history, the whole of human history, as a set of stages, a path along which nations passed. And this led to the birth of classical economics with Adam Smith, much of modern philosophy with David Hume, modern sociology with Ferguson, Miller, Kames, and modern anthropology. It was again a period of this big conflict. One of the most revealing of these was between lowland Scotland and Highland Scotland at this time. A number of the Scots philosophers and so on had actually been born in the Highlands and then came down and were educated in the lowlands. And they certainly, even people like Adam Smith and others, knew quite a lot about what a clan Highland society was like. And particularly after 1745, the Battle of Culloden and the destruction of the clan system, they saw these 2 systems in vivid contrast. There's a description of this in Hunter's Crofting Community, the change of the 18th century, which is worth looking at as a sharp conflict. He says, in the world of the 18th century, Britain was recognisably unique. The peasant was vanishing from the land. End of quote. By the 1740s, then, the modernisation of the British society was everywhere proceeding apace. Everywhere, that is, except in the Highlands of Scotland. There, an older form of life was still persisting, a way of life whose social forms were based not on ties of economic dependency, as was increasingly the case in the south, but on the much older bonds of kinship. Here I'm quoting Hunter. In the Highlands, the descent group, defined genealogically and institutionalized as the tribe or clan, was the focus of all social, economic and cultural activity. So it was a kinship-based clan system in conflict with an individualistic, contractual, money market-based civilization to the south. And yet, even in the Highlands, there was a tension, because certainly after 1745 and even before, the Highland chiefs were beginning to see where their future lay, and they were beginning to break the bonds, move to live in London, turning their estates into places where they could grow sheep and pasture sheep, and getting rid of the bonds with their retainers. Because of the gulf, and I quote again Hunter, the higher ranks of Highland society were well accustomed to moving in two cultural universes, that of the Gallic Highland on the one hand, and that of southern Britain and the rest of Western Europe in the other. It was at this point that the 18th century chief's two roles came into irreconcilable conflict with one another. As a southern socialite, he needed more and more money. As a tribal patriarch, he could do very little to raise it. Until 1746, and this is Hunter again, the Highlands lay outside the effective limits of British jurisdiction, and the law and order which were necessary preconditions for the commercial and industrial developments occurring in the south were consequently absent. In the Highlands, however, a chief's status and even his life depended on the number of armed men he could command. But this all changed after pacification of the north after Culloden. The destruction of this clan system led to the introduction of roads, of market forces in a new way, and the Highland retainers were dismissed. It was a huge change, nicely put by Dr. Johnson, who went for a tour round. There was perhaps never any change of national manners so quick, so great, and so general as that which operated in the Highlands by the late conquest and the subsequent laws. The clans retain little now of their original character. Their ferocity of temper is softened, their military ardour is extinguished, their dignity of independence is depressed, their contempt for government subdued, and their reverence for their chiefs abated, as Alan Donald James MacFarlane, one of the great warring clans of that time, who was subdued. I also stand between the two systems. So you have the great Scottish philosophers. You have Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, who draws on all his knowledge. He had read almost everything that was possible to read, and he sat there for 25 years writing The Wealth of Nations and lecturing, and he contrasted different parts of Europe, so the more backward economically southern part of Europe, the middle part, and contrasted it with England, and he contrasted what was happening in England and America and Holland with what was happening elsewhere in Europe, and particularly with China, which he saw as a great civilization, but static. He saw nearly all the world as static except for England, to a certain extent Holland and America. Then there was David Hume, and here he was obviously a great founder of one of the founders of modern philosophy. And he was also a great historian. His treatise on human nature of 1734 to 5 was almost completely neglected, but later had a huge emphasis. And in the 1750s he started his celebrated History of England, the first volume published in 1754, and then in 1755 his Natural History of Religion. So he was another founding figure, as was Lord Keynes, who looked at the legal systems of the world and contrasted them. John Miller, in his Origin of the Distinction of Ranks in 1771, was influenced by Keynes, Montesquieu and Adam Smith, and developed the idea of social progress and of the stages. His stage theory in the Origin of the Distinction of Ranks, he reconstructed civil society through a series of stages. There was the pastoral stage, there was the feudal and commercial stage, and then something was emerging into the future. Adam Ferguson, in his essay on the history of civil society in 1767, was a Gaelic-speaking Highlander who again looked at the two systems, and he later influenced people like John Stuart Mill and Comte and Saint-Simon. He again began to develop the idea of unilinear social development. A lot of the ideas were summarized, synthesized, and made clearer by Dougal Stewart, writing at the end of the century and the early 19th century in his dissertation on the history of languages. And I'll just quote a little bit of Dougal Stewart, who particularly made Adam Smith's ideas clearer. He says, when in such a period of society as that in which we live, we compare our intellectual acquirements, our opinions, manners and institutions with those which prevail among rude tribes, it cannot fail to occur to us an interesting question: by what gradual steps transition has been made from the first simple efforts of uncultivated nature to a state of things so wonderfully artificial and complicated. Whence has arisen that systematical beauty which we admire in the structure of a cultivated language? This is in his work on language. That analogy which runs through the mixture of languages spoken by the most remote and unconnected nations. When the origin of the different sciences and of the different arts, and by what chain has the mind been led from their first rudiments to their last and most refined improvements? Whence the astonishing fabric of the political union, the fundamental principles which are common to all governments, and the different forms which civilized society has assumed in different ages of the world? On most of these subjects, there is very little information to be expected from history, for long before that stage of society when men began to think of recording their transactions, many of the most important steps of their progress had been made. A few insulated facts may perhaps be collected from the casual observations of travellers, but not much is evident, and this gave rise to his theory that what people needed to do was what he called conjectural history. Now, conjectural history means using the method of science in relation to the arts and humanities. In other words, making a conjecture. Popper, the philosopher of science, wrote a book called Conjectures and Refutations. What a scientist does is make a hypothesis, a conjecture, a guess, and then test it. And what Dougal Stewart was suggesting that the great social scientists should do, and that Adam Smith and of course Newton in science had done, was first of all to make a guess, and then try and look around and see whether it fitted what little bits of evidence there was. And this was the great conjectural method. It was condemned much later as useless and dismissed by 20th century anthropologists like Radcliffe Brown. They set themselves against the conjectural method. What they were really against was not the method of guessing, but more the interest in trying to reconstruct long stages of the history of man. By the early 20th century, the emphasis was on what's happening now, functionalism, the current function of things. So the long-term narrative which the 18th century Enlightenment Scots were trying to create seemed to be, well, it either succeeded or it hadn't, but it wasn't our business, really. We were concerned with other things. But in the 18th century, when they were setting out the foundations for the social sciences, then you needed a good deal of guesswork about the origins of languages, of political systems, of economic systems, and this led to a set of hypotheses about the stages through which human societies had evolved. I'll move on to the other side of the channel, to France, and also then to the reaction against all this Enlightenment thinking in the next talk. Thank you.